Hello everybody, and welcome to our session called The Cutting Edge of Digital Forensics. I'm going to introduce our panelists to you. I'm going to do a bad job because I did a good job of putting their CVs in front of you. There would be no room left for the actual panel, so I've just chosen some brief highlights. We're joined by Andy Carvin at 5:30 a.m. in the morning from Washington, I think. Thank you, Andy, for getting up and being with us. Andy's the managing editor at the DFR Lab, the Digital Forensics Research Lab. Before that, he was a senior strategist at NPR's social media desk. And then what I would imagine is his proudest accolade of all is that he was voted best journalist on Twitter at the Shorty Awards in 2012, which I'm not sure if that exists anymore, but it does indicate that he's been digging in the trenches of Twitter for a long time. Followed by Andy will be Tessa Knight, who's a colleague of his, but who works out of the DFR Lab's Africa team. And she's based out of Cape Town. She's a research assistant at the DFR Lab, which is a really terrible title for what she does. She and her colleague there do these amazing massive investigations.
Et puis, sinon, donc,
you might want to change that.
Andy travaille aussi avec Africa Team.
But I trust that everybody can hear me. Followed Tessa, and I've worked quite closely with Andy and Tessa, so I'm really looking forward to their talks. Following Tessa will be Adedeji, Adekunle, who is the Deputy Program Director at the Premium Times Center for Investigative Journalism, a prestiged investigative title. He also leads their fact-checking project, Dubawa. And then finally, Eyal, who's currently the lead data investigator at the Sentry, which is an investigative and policy team that follows the dirty money around war crimes and war profiteering in Africa, or in the world, I think. I've worked with him quite closely as well in the past, and one of the things that we proudly worked on together, which he ran, was he started the first ever data journalism academy in Africa out of his old company, Open Up, which he started. He's also got a Vodacom Journalist of the Year award and a GIJN Global Shining Light award, which is not bad for somebody who essentially is a spreadsheet guy. So welcome to all four of you. The loose logic of this panel is that Andy and Tessa will be presenting case studies from their work around Africa and the world. Then Adedeji is going to be showing some of the tools necessary to produce those kinds of investigations and those kinds of case studies. And then we're going to be following up with Adi talking about something slightly more prickly, which is the kind of ethical considerations around data. The legal issues, the ethical issues, things that aren't often considered when it comes to how and why we get data in our jobs. He's calling it a guided tour to the data underworld. So remember to please drop your questions on the Wova app and they'll get to us. And let us begin. I'm going to ask Andy to kick off, please. And Andy, I'm hoping you can still hear me and you're going to share your screen.
Sorry about that. I could have sworn you said Adi rather than Andy, so I was confused for a moment. Let me pull up my screen for a second. All right, hopefully all of you can see my slides as I pull them up. So as Chris said, well, thanks for having me, everyone. I truly appreciate it. Sorry, I can't be there in person. As Chris noted, I am managing editor at the Digital Forensic Research Lab, or DFR Lab, based in Washington, D.C. And I wanted to talk about a project that we did last year and published earlier this year, a research project with the Associated Press that Tessa was actually involved in as well, in which we wanted to try to understand how certain types of rumors and narratives about COVID had spread around the spread around the world, spread around the internet, and were impacting geopolitics, and specifically rumors about COVID being some form of bioweapon. And so what we wanted to do is really focus on 4 countries that were already really in a position to move the conversation forward or move the conversation backward because of geopolitical competition, and the fact that, at least in the case of three of the countries, Russia, the US, and China, would also be places where research regarding COVID itself would likely be taking place. And so the more we could understand how these rumors were being spread, the better we could understand how politicians, political influencers, and governments more broadly were taking messaging and weaponizing it in order to undermine geopolitical adversaries around the world. In order to do this, we started by collecting enormous amounts of data. We went on using both open source and proprietary search tools to collect tweets, Facebook posts, YouTube posts, posts from Weibo in China, and the like, and specifically looking for different terms and phrases related to COVID being a bioweapon, and doing it in as many languages as our team could handle. There were about 10 of us who were doing the research, and across the team spoke nearly around 10 languages, but ultimately collected relevant data from more than 24 languages. And we started pulling together this information in a database with millions of posts in it, and then began analyzing it based on mention dates. So in other words, as we identified a particular narrative, which posts were the first ones to mention it and which ones had the highest level of engagement. And then we tried to code them based on them crossing borders as well. And so from this enormous collection of data, we ultimately identified 311 narrative milestones, if you will. These were posts, videos, state television interviews had been posted online that were making certain claims about COVID being a bioweapon, and ultimately representing 26 countries and 9 different languages. And all of this, of course, is happening in real time, because by the time we started really digging into this research a year ago, last March, these rumors had already spread around the world, and so we had to work backwards, trying to determine the points of origin. In fact, the very first mention of any type of rumor online that COVID could be a bioweapon happened on December 31st of 2019, the same day that China reported to the WHO that they had an outbreak on their hands. And as we started looking through the data set, it became clear, particularly that January, there were certain types of narratives that were beginning to bubble up. But to identify them, what we did was we looked to see what type of terms were being used, and the closeness of the terms in individual posts, and how they related to the closeness of other terms in other posts. And so it wasn't just simply looking for a single keyword and counting the number of times it appeared, but looking at various words that were used again and again within proximity to each other, and then seeing how they broke down into different narratives. So as you see in this network map, the different colors represent essentially different narratives that were using certain words to describe whatever rumor it was people were trying to spread. And in those early days, particularly the first couple of months of COVID, we found 4 different narratives that were that had spread the earliest and with the most levels of engagement. 2 of them were origin narratives. First of all, one was claiming that China created the virus as a bioweapon and that it leaked either accidentally or on purpose from the Wuhan lab. But there was also a counter narrative saying that the US had basically done the same thing at a place called Fort Detrick, not far from where I am here in Washington, DC, and then accidentally brought COVID to the Wuhan to Wuhan in 2019, which hosted the World Military World Games. We also saw 2 other narratives that were more focused on explanations. One of them was, interestingly, an economic explanation, in that the US had somehow engineered a bioweapon because they wanted to use it as leverage against China during trade negotiations. The other much scarier, much more nefarious, but equally not based in fact, was that COVID had been created as some sort of genetically targeted bioweapon that could seek out and destroy individual ethnic groups. And while not all of these rumors are ones that we hear about today, in the earliest days of the narrative, these were the four that we kept on seeing repeated in the data. But what we also wanted to do was to get a better sense of how rumors like this were spreading. And so we then went back and looked through the millions of tweets and Facebook posts and other social media points, and then tried to map out how these messages were connected to each other. So who was replying to whom, who was forwarding whom. And in this massive cloud of posts, literally this represents hundreds and hundreds of thousands of posts across social media in multiple languages and multiple platforms. They started forming communities, if you will, with each color representing a different group discussing a particular set of rumors and having a certain amount of cross-pollination taking place across these communities. So, for example, in Russia, some of the earliest rumors were really just trying to find ways to blame the U.S., saying that it had been created at one of these many U.S.-sponsored labs across Eastern Europe. There's one called the Luger Lab in Georgia, for example. They tried focusing on finding narratives that weren't necessarily original. It didn't seem like they were particularly strategic. So if something was going around somewhere, they would grab onto it. They would amplify it. And in many cases, there were certain individuals who would appear on Russian state television again and again and again, making these claims, blaming the US for engineering COVID. The US, of course, had its own narratives. Many of them were influenced by QAnon in particular, which was rather disturbing, not surprising to discover, but still disturbing. But you also had other outlets varying levels of credibility. So the Washington Times, for example, is a conservative news outlet here in Washington that spread one early post claiming it was a bioweapon, though they ultimately did retract it. But then there were other sites that are known for sharing propaganda that was pro-Russian, like Zero Hedge. You had TV commentators who were going online again and again, making different claims. And then, of course, President Trump came out and said that he had a quote unquote high degree of confidence that COVID had somehow leaked from a lab. And all of this was reflected in the data points that we collected. But as we go back to the map here, you can see there's this large cloud of posts all connected with each other. And among the most influential, these were ones connected with QAnon. It was, as I said, it was a bit disturbing to discover that there were connections with QAnon crossing over towards conservative American media, right-wing media, and essentially the entry points to bring some of these conversations back and forth with other communities of conspiracy theorists, conservative interest groups, and the like. China, meanwhile, at first they pushed really hard to deny that they had caused anything. I mean, they denied that anything was going on at first, arresting journalists and whistleblowers who had claimed that something was happening in Wuhan. But as anti-Chinese in the US, they got much more assertive and started blaming the US first indirectly and then more directly. At one point, Zhao Lijiang, who was a spokesman or is a spokesman for Chinese foreign ministry, started pointing to websites that had really poor reputations in terms of accuracy, as well as connections with Russian narratives, saying that the virus had somehow originated in the US. And then he also put out the claim that it was the US Army's fault by bringing it to Wuhan during the World Military Games in 2019. Iran finally was an interesting case because most of the online conversation and narratives were domestically oriented. But they also had a pretty big problem on their hands because it was one of the first countries where you saw politicians getting very ill very early in the pandemic. They had multiple members of their parliament die from COVID in spring of 2020. They didn't originate many narratives themselves. They tended to recycle ones from other countries, particularly China and Russia. And the people they brought online tended to be American experts that had a reputation for saying anti-Semitic things. We didn't see much evidence of posts that were coming from fake accounts, and instead they were being amplified by official sources, religious authorities, government authorities, and the like. And it was often framed more in terms of a threat against Iran as itself, not from a health perspective, but from a security perspective. And so, as you can see here in this particular corner of the map, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, his messages were popping up in an area that overlapped conspiracies that were coming from supporters of Russian narratives, as well as people who had connections with conservative media. And so no one was really working in isolation here. Everything was cross-pollinating with each other. So essentially, by starting with lexical analysis, we were able to identify recurring narratives, particularly the four suggesting spurious origins of COVID that have not been backed by any of the scientific evidence. But then by continuing with social network analysis, we were able to connect the dots between who was spreading the messages, who the amplifiers were and the influencers were, and how they connected with each other. Now, none of this was easy. It took an enormous amount of manual labor, having to come up with all the search terms in all the different languages, making sure we accounted for the different grammar of like how nouns are declined in certain languages and the like, and also trying to determine which of these had any sort of relevancy to them. It took an incredible amount of work over many, many months. And then finally, we don't want to forget that this type of investigation is limited by the fact when you're using online data sets, you are looking at the information space as it exists in social media. And while it does capture a certain amount of state media messages as they get reposted online, it doesn't necessarily reflect of the conversations that you would have heard in places like community radio, or on television broadcasts that aren't well connected to digital platforms. And of course, any messages that we're spreading by email and other ways that don't get reflected through being posted publicly. But having said all that, given the millions of data points that were out there and the several hundred milestones we were able to discover, ultimately we considered an extremely worthwhile effort that helped us really understand how these rumors played out in the first few months of the COVID pandemic. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Andy. We're going to move now from a kind of a global perspective to an African perspective. Tessa is going to share a screen. So I'll just give her a moment to do that. And Andy, I'm hoping somebody's going to ask a question around impact, because the investigations and research that DFI Lab does is amazing, but I think also part of what is amazing is what you do with those investigations and how you put them out into the world. So I'm hoping somebody's going to ask that question. Tessa, do we have your screen shared?
I don't actually think so. Hang on, let me try again.
I shall ask our tech team to see what they can do. And Tessa's going to be talking about an investigation she did in Uganda, and hopefully if we have enough time, tech limitations allowing, she's going to touch on Sudan as well.
Okay, I believe my presentation is here.
Great, I'll hand over to Tessa Knight.
Wonderful, thank you so much, Chris. So, as Chris said, I'm going to start off by looking at Uganda.
I'm not sure if this should be a claim to fame, but essentially this investigation that I started doing in late December, early January resulted in a large number of Facebook posts and Twitter accounts being removed from the platforms. And Facebook came out and said that a number of the accounts were connected to Uganda's government, to a branch of the ICT ministry. And as a result of that, the government implemented a social media gag and then decided to shut down the internet. And this was about 6, maybe 4 days before they had their presidential elections on January 14th. So obviously shutting down access to social media and shutting down access to the internet has a massive impact on democracy and elections and the electoral process. So yeah, I'm not quite sure how I feel about maybe precipitating that, but anyway, I'm going to walk through this in a very simple way just to show how I got to this point. So what you can see on your screen right now is the number of Facebook and Instagram assets that were removed. When I say assets, I mean pages, accounts, groups, and Instagram accounts. So there were 6 government employees involved, and there were also 2 PR firms that were involved. So I originally came across this network on Twitter. So what I'm showing you now is what I was looking at in early January and late December. I noticed that there was this network of Twitter accounts that were promoting the current president Museveni and then also his employees, so government employees, and they were very supportive of the president. And these posts were posted within a couple of minutes of each other, and they obviously are just copy pasted. This is a pretty simple one. It's just hashtags, but there were entire posts that were like full text, and they were shared within minutes of each other, and they were just completely exactly the same. And when I looked at these accounts, because this sort of immediately makes me suspicious, when I looked at them, they didn't appear very authentic. They were using stolen profile pictures, and they didn't have any personal information. But there were a few that did appear authentic. There was a journalist, there was a kind of suspicious media organization, and there was a PR firm. So again, immediately suspicions are rising. And what I do when I find these kind of things is I go and then I check Facebook, because I want to see if this kind of network is on multiple different platforms. And what I found is that this PR firm, it's the little purple one, I don't think you'll be able to see it properly, called Robusto Communications, and this news website, and it was a legitimate website called Kampala Times, seem to be pretty connected. So here you can see the about pages of Kampala Times and Robusto Communications. And this is just a very preliminary investigation. This is me just trying to get as much information on this network as possible. So as you can see, there's the same cell phone number. There's an email, I've blocked it out just for privacy, and they both have the Kampala Times URL, even though one was for this alleged PR firm. So I saw this, I got very excited, because obviously this is a really great hint for us. I know that this talk is on tools, but technically Facebook about pages aren't really tools, but they give you a lot of information and they give you really fantastic places to start. So I saw this name in the email that is blocked off, and I realized that that corresponded to one of the really, really big Facebook accounts that was promoting Museveni, that was promoting the ruling party, that was spreading sort of disinformation and things like that. And I thought, okay, cool, so maybe I'm starting to find out how this is being operated. And I did check that cell phone number on a piece of software called Truecaller, and I will say immediately, please don't download Truecaller on your cell phone for like privacy issues. I did check it on my PC, but I was able to find out who was the owner of that cell phone number. So the investigation started going, and I thought, okay, let me have a look at this website, Kampala Times, and I saw that a lot of the articles were being posted by this person called Rita Nakamia. And if you think back to the email that I blocked out, Nakamia was in that email. So I'm getting a little bit closer to figuring out what's going on here. And something that I thought was quite interesting is if you actually look at the URL, even though this is the author profile for Rita Nakamia, the URL says Dixon Okello. And that made me think back to the Twitter accounts that I'd been looking at, and Dickens Okello was one of the accounts that I was investigating. Dickens Okello is actually a journalist. So I thought, okay, so we've got these PR firms that are copying and pasting content, press releases from the government and packaging them as news. We've got this website that appears to have some connection to a lot of inauthentic Facebook pages, and we've got this journalist. So what I did then at this point, I had a huge amount of data, and I was quite certain that these accounts were engaging in something that Facebook calls coordinated inauthentic behavior. And we have a partnership with Facebook, so I sent through a bunch of information to them with the names of the PR firms, the Facebook page, and they did their own investigation, and they actually took this data down. And they came out and they said, okay, this is connected to the ICT ministry, and there are government employees involved in this entire investigation. And as a result, the government said that Facebook, and subsequently Twitter as well, were not acting equitably, and they denied access to the platforms. So I wanted to show that, you know, there are fantastic open source tools available out there, and I think Bellingcat has a really great repository of those tools. But these kind of really important and really big investigations can actually be started with the most basic information, and just by looking and poking around. What I do is I actually say that I follow elections and conflict. So I've never really gone into a country's information space ahead of an election or during a conflict and not found any sort of disinformation or information campaigns. So it might be somewhat morbid, but that's kind of what my job is at this moment. And because Uganda was having an election, I poked around, and this is what I found. So I have a few minutes left. I'm looking at the timer Chris has for me, to just very, very briefly talk about this recent investigation that I did on Sudan. This was given to me by a source who tipped me off and gave me a lot of the information already. So I didn't do the same thing that I did in Uganda, where I was poking around and I stumbled across all of these assets. But this Russian disinformation campaign, so it's based in Russia. It was linked to the Internet Research Agency, which obviously is pretty infamous for their involvement in the 2016 American elections. This campaign, what we can see on the right, and it is in Arabic, but what it says is from Russia with love, and it's got the Russian flag and a little heart, and then it says courtesy of Yevgeny Prigozhin. Prigozhin is a Russian oligarch who operates something called the Wagner Group, this paramilitary group. And so Russia's interest in Sudan revolves around a naval base. So I knew that, and the source had tipped me off, and I started looking into this more. Obviously, Prigozhin sending aid to a foreign country is not illegal. He's not allowed to do that. But in a similar manner to the Ugandan pages, what we had was we had these, as you can see, 83 Facebook accounts that were inauthentic, so they were using stolen images, and they were pretending to be someone else. And they were promoting this narrative that Russia is a friend to Sudan. They were spreading disinformation. They were making claims that life in Sudan was better under the rule of strongman al-Bashir, Omar al-Bashir, and they were spreading disinformation about politicians. So I wanted to show you one of the profiles. It was this man who, he was given hair. You can see in the right, the profile picture, I don't know, maybe to make him appear more Sudanese, they gave him some hair. this was taken from the Russian, sort of a Russian equivalent of Facebook, which is called, I'm just going to call it VK, that's the acronym. And so what I thought was quite interesting was I was pretty certain that these were stolen profile pictures, but I did a reverse image search, and I'm sure we'll go into that a little bit more, and I couldn't find anything until I used the Russian social media, the Russian search engine site Yandex. Because these were taken from VK, from a Russian site, I was able to find the original, so that's the man on the left who apparently does not have good enough hair for this influence operation. Because they were uploaded to VK, I was able to find them on Yandex. So I guess with that, I kind of wanted to just say that don't necessarily give up when something doesn't work out immediately. And the very, very last thing I wanted to just emphasize is, even though we do have all these incredible tools, a lot of the work that I do, as Andy kind of hinted at, is pretty manual. So what I had here in this investigation was I noticed just going through all of these pages and all of these assets and trying to find things. What I found was that these were copied and pasted, which is something that we see pretty regularly, and they had been taken from a Sudanese pro-military group. So we kind of get to see the agenda here that's coming through. And I guess the last thing that I wanted to emphasize was the importance of having local partners, something that I don't think that I would have picked up on because I don't speak Arabic, was the fact that a lot of these posts had been translated from a different language. It's quite difficult to reverse engineer that, so I'm not sure what the original language was, but they'd been translated, and so to a native Arabic speaker, they didn't make any sense. And that's not something I could really figure out with Google Translate or translation tools. So it was really wonderful having people from Code for Africa working with me to try and get to the bottom of this and finding out that it was connected to the IRA. That was very exciting. Okay, so I'm going to hand over. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tessa, and also thanks for reminding me that I forgot to say who I am, now that you mentioned Code for Africa. I'm the Deputy CEO for Code for Africa, which is a big pan-African federation of data and tech labs and hubs. Thank you, Tessa, for that talk about the very under-researched area of hairstyles and misinformation in Africa, which I don't think many people have touched on at this conference yet. And I'm going to hand over to Adedeji, who's going to move us from the case studies to a kind of a slightly more practical look at the tools.
Okay, thanks a lot, Chris. I want to assume I'm audible. I'll share my screen now. Okay, thank you very much for the intro. Like Chris said earlier, my name is Deji Adekunle, and I am the Deputy Program Director at PTCIJ, which is a West African media think tank, where we innovate around the problems that we face in the media. And I also happen to lead our West African fact-checking and verification project called Dubawa. And I'll be taking an example from the work we've done at Dubawa to show how these tools work, and also giving a couple of suggestions as to what tools you could use and what they could do, and how they could help you with your journalism, your investigations, and your verification attempts. So that's what I'll be doing here. So first off, the example we'll be using will be one we had to deal with in Ghana. And this, just to add more context, this very fact check I'll be looking at was also nominated for the Africa Check Awards for perhaps the best fact-checking article. And this example, this case study basically is about a video that went viral accusing the then president, who's still the president of Ghana, President Nana Akufo-Addo, of receiving a $40,000 bribe in order to pardon a minister accused of corruption. Now, this video went pretty viral. And following the thoughts from Tess, it was good that we had a team in Ghana. So because we needed to translate, it wasn't in English. A good chunk of it was in Twi. So we did that, and at the end of our work, we found out it was totally false, and the forensic tools were really influential in our verification attempt. How did we do this? We got the multiple videos that were trending online. The first video came out, and then in order to defend themselves, the accused party or the accused political wing put out a clearer, more audible video, which they claimed is the true original video where the viral video came from. What we did was we used visual cues. And before I even talk about the visual cues, I just want to stress that while we're discussing tools, the real craft of verification or investigating is still quite manual. Tools are just tools. They only help you do your work better and solve some problems. So you have to think through these problems yourself manually and then use the tools when necessary. So we used cues in the tools and looked at old videos and pictures to, of course, geolocate and confirm that, yes, this video was set, the scene of the video was set in the president's home office. Then we conducted some forensic analysis on different parts of the video to ascertain if there's some editing or some manipulation there. Then we looked at the timeline, which was very key because they accused him of doing this while he was president. And we used reverse image search and tools for that, and also identified the contextual information that was used to create the false narrative and debunked it. So this is the first a picture of what we did to identify the manipulation. So this was the viral video, and we used a tool called Forensically. It's open source, it's available online. All you have to do is Google Forensically, and you will even find a manual on how a video by the creator on how to use the tool. So our researchers used Forensically, and the first thing they did was they discovered that there was quite a lot of noise distortion. In other words, the videos, the scenes in the videos weren't clear. They weren't clear, and that was done deliberately to interrupt people's own verification attempts. So if the video is blurry, you can't use the natural visual cues to ascertain if this is authentic or not. And that was something that we used the magnifier tool for Forensically to ascertain. And we also did the same using we did the same to the second video, which was a lot clearer, as you can see when you compare the first and the second. And then using that same magnifier, we're able to pick up some visual cues. For example, noting that the gifts that were brought in the video had the slogan and the tags and the design of his campaign in 2016 before he was elected. So that was a huge cue for us. We also looked at other posts trying to prove that it did actually happen while he was president. And they used an image in his office which showed him and the just past German Chancellor Angela Merkel in a portrait. To ascertain the veracity of that, we ran a reverse image search and did some social media investigation on his profile to find that this image came from a visit sorry, I'm having a blackout here. a visit from the German Chancellor in 2012. So that was a big piece of evidence that we used in the verification process. At the end of the day, we were able to show that using forensically that the video was manipulated, the time we're able to chronolocate using visual cues, and this helped us to debunk that piece of misinformation that went that spread so much and was viral in the build-up to the 2020 general elections in Ghana. Now I'll try to just recommend a couple of tools and explain what a couple of them do to help people who want to look into using forensic analysis to boost their work. And I'll start with image and video verification. So you have forensically there, which I already mentioned. It helps with image magnification. It helps with noise detection. It also helps with error level analysis and clone detection. In other words, to see if there were repeated images used to in a set frame. Then we also have reverse image search, which you can do on TinEye, using TinEye, Google, Yandex, and Bing. And also we have InVid, a tool used to break down videos into screen grabs in order to help you do the image verification that you need to carry out. So these are a couple of tools that could help with that. Then for online social network mapping, and this is really important when you're doing investigations online, Follow.me is quite good. It helps you with Twitter profiles to paint a picture of the activity and interaction profile of a Twitter handle. It also gives cues, especially in its timeline function, to whether you're dealing with a real individual or you're dealing with an online bot. Another tool that helps with that is Twitter audits. It helps you check what percentage of your followers or people you are following are actual people. Then you can use the CrowdTangle link checker to check the virality and the spread and sharing pattern of a particular post online, and the tool can help you magnify that effort. And then Truth Explorer, a tool by the Night Lab, helps you to paint a picture of the content going around a specific hashtag or a specific subject of discussion. And we have other tools like check usernames that helps you to see where usernames are repeated across different social media platforms, and Hoaxy, which helps you show the discussion pattern of information across social media platforms. Then if you're looking to do some geolocation and chronolocation being of course geographical location, chronolocation looking at the timeline of different occurrences, we still get to use Google Maps, Google Earth, Yandex Map, and Bing Maps. And to give out some information on the different browsers here, Google is very general and has quite a very large reach, but like the example Tessa gave earlier, Yandex has a specific reach that covers in more detail Russia and a good number of cities in Central Asia. So if you don't get responses on Google, I advise you to use other search engines, being more US friendly. Wolfram Alpha is a tool that helps you to check weather data. And that really helps with geolocation and chronolocation. It helps you ascertain whether it was a sunny day yesterday. And this mixed with visual cues in videos and pictures can really help with your verification and investigation. Then you have SunCalc tool, which is also used for chronolocation, Flight Radar to check what flights are in the air, and Vessel Finder for marine vessels. We also have an easy example also of such tools another blackout, sorry, of such tools like that, and how it can also be used for your presentation and your visualization. For example, the Pandora paper article published on the Premium Times used a Giphy and used geolocation to show the spread and distribution of properties bought using offshore accounts in the UK. And this is a good example of how these online tools and forensic tools can help you at different stages of your investigation or verification attempt. It can help you at your sourcing part. It can also help you at your presentation or publication or publishing efforts. So this, I believe, is where I'll stop. I hope I've not taken too much time. And over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Adedeji. Adi, I'm going to ask you to share a screen. While you do that, I hope that list of tools is going to be made available for delegates at Adedeji somewhere. Also, if we run out of time for questions, I'm going to ask the speakers to try and answer some of your questions on the Wova app, but I'm hopefully we'll have time. Adi, are you good to go?
Yes, I am. Right, a brief tour through the data underworld and what it means for journalists. So I'm going to just take in a bit of a ride. You may have been to some of these places, you may not, but this is a nice safe way to do it. Right, so in the last few years, you've probably seen this sort of thing popping up all over the place, 60 compromised passwords, change this, you've reused that, etc. So it's largely come from this website. Have I been pwned? Put in your email address, and oh my God, I can't believe that it's, my email address has been hacked so many different times. In this case, it was 12 data breaches. That's not a real email address. But unfortunately, have I been pwned? I say unfortunately, just for the inquisitive. Doesn't really give you any more information apart from whether you've been hacked or not. A website called Dehashed, it's a paid-for site, but it's way more interesting. So you see it's 14.5 billion compromised assets. So when they say in their search box, search for anything, they really do mean search for anything. And there's a ton of stuff that really comes up. So I searched for my man XX, and you can see that this, the email address is fake, but this is a real person. 240 results found. And in many cases, you actually get the password. So you can see bottom right, password was Molly600. Another time was Sergio24, 1101, one asshole. Some of these things are quite embarrassing if you search your own email address and you realize, wow, I was not very smart 10 years ago. Anyway, so that's what Dehash comes up with. There's a ton of other stuff. From a journalist perspective, this is not just trying to hack into people's accounts, but you look at their usernames, which means you can look at you can look for their identities and other social media, etc. There's a lot of really interesting contextual information that's useful. But of course, there's serious ethical questions as well, and you need to be very, very careful in terms of how you use these tools. But let's keep going. Right, so where does it all come from? Where did these guys, where did Dehashed and Have I Been Pwned, where do they find this stuff? So this is where it starts to get a bit dodgier. I've kind of spray painted over the name of the website so I don't get blamed for promoting hacking and that sort of thing. But anyway, this website is pretty incredible in terms of what's for sale, what's going on, what's available for free, etc. You can see this advert. In fact, I've taken a couple of screenshots of the advert. Strong DDoS attack service, special custom DDoS methods, take websites and servers offline. Years of experience, dedicated support staff. So, they take this sort of stuff quite seriously. It's not just, hackers with hoods. It's, this is a whole ecosystem. So, of course, it is the underworld, so no one trusts anyone else. There are these middleman services. So if you want to buy something, there, you don't necessarily trust the seller, but hopefully there's a middleman who has higher, reputation who you do trust. There's an escrow service. Of course, everything works in Bitcoin. And, not all Bitcoins are created equally. Did you get your Bitcoin from an exchange, or did you get your Bitcoin from somewhere else? Because Bitcoins that came from an exchange are traceable in many, in many cases. And so, Bitcoins are not fungible, which is I found to be quite interesting. Right, so this is just their free page. I mean, it just goes on and on these various databases which you can download. Let's see, there's 152 million records from the Adobe database. You can see here, this is in 2019, 500 million Facebook profiles available for free. Just what's really important is that it was scraped. And often you see in the news where people say that Facebook was hacked or this, that, the other thing. And in this case, it wasn't, right? It was scraped. Literally, this is the information that you put on your profile, on your public profile, and someone went and downloaded it, which is very different to a hack. And those distinctions are quite important. Anyway, I mean, there are tons and tons of these things, and this is really just the data which I think no one really wants anymore. So you might find something useful, but the really juicy stuff is for sale. So I mean, the forums go pretty deep into things. I mean, there's doxing for hire. I mean, people say, "Well, I can ruin a person's life for $200." Anyway, I'm not going to give you the URL for that website. Right. So ransomware. So we keep on hearing about these ransomware sites. What is it exactly? So there are a bunch of these groups online. Some of them more established, some of them less established. Here's a list that I came across. Of course, it's all dark web, Tor browser, all that sort of good stuff. Here's just a screenshot from Black Matter Ransomware. What they do is they go to some sort of hapless mom and pop shop. Usually, they hack their systems, encrypt the data, delete the drives, and then they then try to curse them to pay for the decryption. And in many cases, it's sort of small to medium businesses. You do obviously get the big companies, but that the marketplace for data for bigger companies is somewhat different. This is a group called Grief. I like at the top left there, it says Grief. There are some completed griefs. So complete grief is either that it's now been established that the ransomee has decided not to pay, and then they just make the data publicly available. And griefs in progress is where they slowly start to reveal what data they have to people, and that they're still trying to get money out of, in this case, XKH group. Marked up this classifieds, but this top left thing is Israel. 450 gigabytes, full private for information, critical company data and phone numbers. And they say, I mean, this is big money. It's not massive money, but it's big money. $5,000 in the first week, and then if in the second week, they're going to charge you $8,000. And they say they're only going to sell it to 2 buyers, and they're going to take it down. But just to test, you can download 1 million free lines. So if you just there's a lot of stuff that you can get online without paying, just as a sample. Bureau van Dijk, Moody's, there's a lot of information there. It's really, really juicy data. Right, so there are some threats. So this is a quote from one of the websites. If you're a client who declined the deal and did not find your data on the cartel's website, or did not find valuable files, this does not mean that we forgot about you. It only means the data was sold, and therefore it did not publish in free access. So there's some creepy stuff going on. However, and this thing really took me by surprise, is codes of conduct. So this group, right, they say they are not a ransomware gang. They don't encrypt or delete data. All they do is penetration testing, etc. But they, expect the poor companies who are hacked to pay them a bounty, and if not, then they take their sensitive data. So I'm not exactly sure how they are different from a ransomware gang, but these guys are different, right? So if you look on the top right, they don't attack hospitals, critical infrastructure, nuclear power stations, power plants, water treatment facilities, pipelines, oil refineries, education, non-profits. And if your company is on that list, you can ask for a free decryption. In fact, another group was saying not only if you're a non-profit, not only will they decrypt your data for you, they'll apologize, but then they'll also help patch your vulnerabilities. So this is just completely bizarre. So the kind of the bad guys playing Robin Hood in some ways. So obviously this sort of stuff is pretty sordid, but we do recognize some other leaks which have resulted in real world positive impact. Sorry, I'll get there. So obviously we recognize WikiLeaks. There's a group called the Distributed Denial of Secrets. They're pretty incredible in terms of what they have there. Their claim to fame is really that they publish raw data, whereas WikiLeaks does censor some of the stuff and curate it, etc. If you go to Distributed Denial of Secrets, you can get terabytes and terabytes of information, some of which is questionable as to whether it's in the public interest or not. So BlueLeaks is this massive leak around the US police, etc. There are bank websites. There's a whole bunch of stuff there. So just recently, this El Salvador police database was released with a lot of information about officers. And this was from a group called FOCO Leaks. So that's available by BitTorrent. In this case, it's a small file, 4.5 megs, but you do get many terabytes of data that's available there. So the question that the DDoS people say, well, like, how do they decide to release the data? Firstly, they decide whether it's in the public interest. And the other one is whether they can make a case for the veracity of the contents. And they say the data is a resource and a record, and it needs to be open. And right at the end, there's something which is a little scary in Latin, which translates to know the truth, though the heavens may fall and the world burn. So very much, of the anarchy. But these are the leaks that we know and love. Pandora Papers, of course, Panama Papers, Paradise Papers, Gupta leaks. We've seen some really positive outcomes from these leaks. But the difference between these and some of these, it becomes a little difficult sometimes to distinguish. But then the question is, right, so the edge cuts, what about GDPR, POPIA, the privacy laws, etc.? What do they mean for large-scale data analysis? Because actually they're flying, they're trying to reduce the number or the size of databases and the people who have these databases. Whereas if you are a journalist and you want to create a large database, or you have a leak, you want as large a database as possible, especially for connections, etc. So we are in a bit of a strange place at the moment, and so in this case, the GDPR places the burden of data protection on the data controller or data processor. So if you were to download a leak, say, forget about whether you are allowed to have it or not. If your system is hacked and there's private information that's leaked into the public space, then you are held liable. Data does become a lot more useful when it combines with other data. And so we may take data which today might not necessarily be in the public interest. We don't know if this particular person is someone who we should be investigating. But maybe 2 years down the line, another leak surfaces which we can now use to connect the dots. So for 2 years, we have a data set which we can't really justify keeping it, but we hope that in the future it may be useful. And so this is the game that we need to play. At what point are we data custodians, and what point can we say this is in the public interest, or there's a journalist exception, etc.? People who say that there's a journalistic exception, I don't think, it's not yet clear. These things haven't necessarily been tested in court yet. Just a really quick, not really a case study, but some examples of why big data sets are useful. So PowerShip, obviously controversial around the world, definitely in South Africa. If you look at the OCCRP Aleph site, which is one of the best sites online for massive data sets, just all in one place, you search for carabiners, which that's the company who and the family who run PowerShip. You get tons and tons of results, more than 10,000 results for Carabiners company. So if you want to cross-reference with the Turkish Commercial Gazette, Istanbul Chamber of Commerce, Georgian company documents, etc., go to OCCRP. At the Century, we have something similar, although more focused on a graph. So here we have This is just a small graph that I extracted from our database of Car Powership South Africa, and it's connected to the Power Group company, who have a 49% interest in Car Powership. And then the Carradines brothers, and here all these companies are from various different jurisdictions. This didn't come from one database, it came from a dozen databases, but altogether gives us a really, really good picture of what's going on. So creating these large databases is very useful. Can we justify keeping them is not, is not so clear. Just looking at POPIA, South African privacy law, a data subject may institute a civil action for damages in the court, having jurisdiction against the responsible party, etc., etc. And then the courts can award any amount that is just and equitable, including damages, compensation, etc., etc. So, I mean, this thing could be pretty costly if you make a mistake. So you definitely need to have your lawyers at hand. Now, I mentioned earlier, the distinction really matters, right? So a hack, did someone actually hack a system? Did someone crack some sort of intellectual property? Was it a scrape like the Facebook data? Was it a leak? And so there are nuances to every one of these data sets. Not everything is the same. If you're looking at people's usernames and passwords and personal information, it's quite different to maybe company documents, registration documents, and jurisdictions matter, etc. So it is a very complicated field. So just my last slide, we are really at the confluence of technology, cybersecurity, big data, ethics, and law. If you are moving in the direction of large data analysis, you do have to be very careful about your cybersecurity, because you're now a data processor, and so any leaks from your side, any hacks, you can be held liable for. And so it's not an easy field. I'm not going to come to you and say this is the answer, but rather with the question, where do we go from here? There are many questions to ask, and no one really has the answers. And I've spoken to a number of organizations around the world about it, and they all have their opinions, and those opinions don't necessarily match, which tells me that we haven't yet come to a point where where there is agreement about how do we deal with this sort of stuff. Yep, and that is my presentation.
Thank you very much, Adi. Well, fascinating. I think along with the question of the use of AI in newsrooms, this is going to be one of the big and thorny issues that newsrooms are going to need to debate going forward. I think we have time for, and thank you to all the panelists, I think we have time for a question from Nairobi. So if we could cross there. Have Nairobi. Fortunately, there's no sound. But quite a lot of gesticulating, which will carry us over in this awkward moment. Yeah, I don't think. Okay, I think I'm going to have to step in, unfortunately. Thank you, Nairobi, for trying. I assume we've been hacked or cracked or just hijacked since. No, that's more a Joburg thing. Okay, I'm going to go to one of my own questions. Thank you for trying, Nairobi, if you can hear me. I have so many, actually, but maybe I should just quickly ask Adi what the end game is here for data mining of this sort. I mean, is it going to happen? Is the same thing going to happen that's happened with conventional extractive industry mining? Are we going to destroy the environment? Is this breaking both journalism and data-driven investigative journalism? What are we going to do?
I mean, we're in trouble. There's no question. And the reason why is that these privacy laws are understandable and important. We're in a situation where it's very, very difficult to justify that we are keeping data about people. So let's say Panama Papers, it's been, since 2016 that the data's been around. And yes, a lot of marrow has been sucked out of that data set. But what about the 99% of the data set of people who are just minding their own business? And, you can't really say that they are that there is a public interest in keeping their data. But we do know that the Panama Papers have been incredibly useful, and then all the leaks that have followed. I don't know what the end game is, but I do know that question is going to have to be answered before a a news agency is hammered with a big lawsuit, having to kind of to deal with the fact that they are managing data by people that they shouldn't be.
Do we have Nairobi? I hear some audio.
De fin de la ligne, on veut entrer dans ce jeu.
Nope, we don't. We have another unexplained hack. Let me ask Andy. There's so many questions for all the panelists, but just to ask Andy, kind of what is the, what do you do with these investigations? How does DFR Lab make a difference in the world with these kinds of investigative pieces? I mean, it stretches across so many territories, so many languages. How do you measure that impact?
Well, it depends. In this particular project, we partnered with the Associated Press, which has an enormous international reach, so much so that the Chinese Foreign Ministry had some very choice words for the investigation, and went on at length during a press conference, essentially doubling down on blaming the U.S. for supposedly bringing COVID to Wuhan. But, that doesn't happen every day. So what we try to do is combine our case studies with training we conduct around the world. Tessa's been very active working with your team in Code for Africa, doing trainings, for example. We have an initiative called Digital Sherlocks, and several times a year we bring in a cohort of around 400 people. These are journalists, people from NGOs, university students, and we offer them free training in digital forensics. They get to choose from as many as 40 different courses that we offer over the course of the semester, and we do that a couple of times a year. And one of the great things about that is, as we create case studies, we're able to have more types of examples that we can include in our training that are more relevant to the places and the people that we're training. It doesn't make sense for like a white guy like me to parachute halfway around the world and give yet another example of something involving Donald Trump, for example. It's much more useful in many cases when we have our staff who are based in the region, are part of the communities, part of the cultures, and are able to use case studies about things that have happened in their communities or within their countries as a way to teach digital forensics and open source research. And when that works well, some of these students we end up realizing they're so talented that we partner with them. And so we're now at a point where some of these digital Sherlocks now do investigations with us as well. And while all that's going on, we are in regular touch with a number of governments, with policymakers, with news organizations. The way we look at it is we want people to understand what we find and allow us to explain why we think it's relevant, so they can hopefully translate that into smart policy making, better policies by the platforms, more informed decision making in terms of how news organizations cover influence operations and democracy around the world. And so for us, the story doesn't end when we publish the story. In many ways, that's the beginning of the process of using those case studies to teach others about not only the issue at hand, but the techniques we use to go about finding them.
Sadly, we've run out of time. We did get Nairobi back, but we don't have time for the question. Although a shout out hello to my Code for Africa colleagues in Dakar and Nairobi who are running the AIJC sessions there. Just to remind you that there's a Bellingcat Digital Forensics Masterclass today at 14:45 Central African Time. And then to answer a question from Silence Mugadzaweta from Zimbabwe about how do you use these digital resources, there are a whole bunch of workshops tomorrow about this. So please do look it up on the program and attend there. Panelists, thank you so much. I wish we had another hour. And I hope we can pick this up in the virtual world, the extra virtual world again. Thank you very much.